The house did not just feel cold, it felt predatory. It was a sprawling, Victorian-style structure that Sarah's husband had inherited, filled with narrow corridors and floorboards that groaned like restless spirits. But the most unsettling thing in the house wasn't the architecture. It was Martha. At 60, Sarah's mother-in-law moved with a silent, haunting efficiency, her presence always announced by the faint scent of stale lavender and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of her heels on the hardwood. To anyone else, Martha might have looked like a grieving widow trying to maintain order. But to Sarah, she was a vulture circling a cradle. Sarah sat in the dim light of the nursery, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the hand-knitted blue cap on Leo's head. To her, Leo was the only soft thing left in a world made of jagged edges. He was small for his age, pale and quiet. So quiet that sometimes Sarah had to press her ear against his chest for minutes just to be sure. She often told herself he was just a good baby, a calm soul who understood the tension radiating through the walls. But every time she looked into those glass-like eyes, a shiver of dread raced down her spine. It wasn't because of the baby, it was because of the woman watching them from the doorway. Sarah didn't have to turn around to know Martha was there. The air in the room always seemed to thin when she approached. Martha stood in the shadows, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mask of disapproval. She never stepped fully into the nursery, as if an invisible barrier kept her from the child. "He needs to be changed, Sarah," Martha said, her voice a low, raspy vibrato that grated on Sarah's nerves. "He's been sitting in that same spot for hours. It isn't natural for a child to be that still." Sarah's grip tightened on the edge of the crib. "He's sleeping, Martha. He's peaceful. Why can't you just let him be?" "Peaceful?" Martha stepped forward, the light from the hallway catching the deep lines of bitterness etched around her mouth. "That's not peace. That's a lack of life. And look at him, look at his face. He has none of our features. My son was a vibrant, crying boy. This thing you cherish, he doesn't belong here." The words felt like physical blows. Sarah stood up, positioning her body between Martha and the cradle. "He is your grandson. How can you be so cruel? Is it because you can't control him? Or is it because you hate that I'm the one who brought him into this family?" Martha let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Grandson? I know a cuckoo in the nest when I see one, Sarah. You've brought a shadow into this house and called it sunshine. But shadows don't stay hidden forever. Eventually the light finds them." Without another word, Martha turned and retreated into the darkness of the hallway. Sarah stayed frozen for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at Leo. In the flickering light of the nightlight, his skin looked almost gray, and his little hand, tucked under the blanket, felt unnervingly stiff. She quickly convinced herself it was just the chill of the room. She began to notice the small, malicious acts Martha performed daily. The way she would accidentally leave the back door open to let the freezing draft blow toward the nursery. The way she would stare at the baby monitor with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. Sarah's paranoia began to bloom like a dark flower. She started seeing Martha everywhere, in the reflection of the hallway mirror, standing at the end of the garden path, peering through the nursery window from the outside. She became convinced that Martha wasn't just cold. She was dangerous. Every time Martha offered to help with the baby, Sarah saw it as a threat. When Martha reached for the blue blanket, Sarah saw claws. When Martha suggested the baby needed a bath, Sarah imagined the water being too deep, too cold. The isolation was the worst part. Sarah's husband, Mark, was always away on business, leaving her alone in this psychological war zone. Whenever she tried to tell him about his mother's behavior over the phone, he would sigh, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She's just old, Sarah. She lost her husband, and then, everything else happened. She's just struggling to adjust. Please just try to be patient." Patient? The word felt like an insult. How could she be patient when her child's life was at stake? She began to lock herself in the nursery for hours, skipping meals just so she wouldn't have to face Martha in the kitchen. She began to skip sleep, too, convinced that the moment she closed her eyes, Martha would slip into the room and snatch Leo away. One evening, Sarah was in the kitchen brewing tea, her eyes heavy with dark circles. She heard the familiar creak of the floorboards upstairs. It was coming from the nursery. Panic surged through her, cold and paralyzing. She dropped the porcelain cup, ignoring the way it shattered against the tile, and sprinted up the stairs. She burst into the nursery, gasping for air. Martha was standing by the window, the heavy velvet curtains drawn back to reveal a moonless, black sky. She was holding Leo's favorite rattle, a silver heirloom that had belonged to Mark's father. She wasn't shaking it. She was just staring at it, her thumb tracing the intricate engravings with a look of profound sorrow. "Put it down," Sarah hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Martha didn't look up. "He never even got to use this, did he? What are you talking about? He plays with it every day." Sarah lunged forward and snatched the rattle from Martha's hand. "Get out! Get out of this room and never come back in here." Martha finally looked at her. Her eyes weren't filled with the anger Sarah expected. They were filled with a terrifying, watery pity. "You're living in a dream, Sarah. But dreams always turn into nightmares when you refuse to wake up." As Martha walked past her, she brushed against Sarah's shoulder. The contact felt like ice. Sarah turned back to the cradle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She picked up the baby, pulling him close to her chest. She expected to feel the warmth of his body, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the faint scent of baby powder. But there was only the smell of dust and the stiffness of the blue wool. "It's okay, Leo," she whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused as she rocked back and forth in the dark. "Mommy's here. I won't let the bad woman hurt you. I'll find a way to make her go away. I'll find the proof. I'll show everyone what she's trying to do." Outside, the wind howled against the glass, sounding like a woman screaming in the distance. Or perhaps it was just the house, mourning the secrets buried within its walls. Sarah didn't notice. She was too busy planning her escape, too busy building a fortress out of shadows, unaware that the walls were already closing in. The war had begun, and in Sarah's mind, there was only one way it could end. With Martha behind bars, and her son finally safe in a world that didn't exist. The sun had no warmth as it filtered through the dusty lace curtains of the dining room. Sarah watched Martha through the crack of the door, her eyes narrowed. Martha was scrubbing the floor, her movements rhythmic and obsessive, as if she were trying to wash away a stain that refused to vanish. To Sarah, this wasn't just cleaning, it was a performance. Martha was reclaiming the house, inch by inch, erasing any trace that Sarah and Leo had ever been there. Sarah retreated to the kitchen, her movements feline and silent. She had begun her mission. On the kitchen counter sat a small, black device she had ordered online, a hidden camera disguised as a common USB charger. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed evidence. She needed the world to see the way Martha looked at the nursery when she thought no one was watching. She needed to capture the cold, calculated way Martha would reach for Leo's things, only to pull back with a sneer. "You're very quiet today, Sarah." Martha's voice drifted from the hallway, sharp and sudden. Sarah jumped, nearly dropping the device. She shoved it into her pocket, her skin flushing. "I'm just tired, Martha." Leo didn't sleep well. He was restless, as if he knew someone was lurking outside his door. Martha entered the kitchen, wiping her damp hands on her apron. She looked older today. The shadows under her eyes were deep purple, and her shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible weight. She didn't look like a villain. She looked like a woman hollowed out by a long, exhausting war. But Sarah knew better. This was a facade, the ultimate weapon of a master manipulator. "Sarah," Martha said, her voice unusually soft. "Mark called this morning. He's worried. He says you aren't answering his texts. He says you're talking about things that don't make sense. He doesn't understand because he isn't here." Sarah snapped, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "He doesn't see how you treat us. He doesn't see the way you look at the baby as if he's a mistake. You want him gone, don't you? You want this house all to yourself again." Martha took a step forward, her hands reaching out in a tentative gesture of comfort. Sarah recoiled as if Martha's skin were caustic. "I want you to be well," Martha whispered, a tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "I want my daughter-in-law back. The woman who used to laugh, who used to love this family. Sarah, please. Look at me. Look at the nursery. Really look." "I am looking." Sarah screamed. I see everything. I see your hatred. I see your schemes. She turned and fled up the stairs, the sound of her own frantic breathing filling her ears. Once inside the nursery, she slammed the door and locked it. She leaned her back against the wood, gasping. She looked at the crib. Leo was there, or so she told herself, wrapped in his blue blanket. She picked him up, her hands trembling. It's okay, she crooned, though her voice was jagged. She can't hurt you. I'm going to get the proof today. I'm going to put the cameras everywhere. They'll take her away, Leo. They'll put her in a place where she can never look at us again. For the next few hours, Sarah moved like a woman possessed. She placed the hidden camera in the bookshelf, wedged between a collection of fairy tales and a silver-framed photograph of Mark as a child. She tucked a digital voice recorder inside the stuffing of a teddy bear sitting on the rocking chair. Every click of a button felt like a victory, a brick in the wall she was building to keep Martha out. As evening fell, the atmosphere in the house shifted from cold to suffocating. Sarah sat in the rocking chair, staring at the baby monitor. The screen was grainy, showing the empty hallway. Suddenly, a figure appeared. Martha. Martha didn't enter the room. She stood at the threshold, her forehead pressed against the doorframe. Sarah watched the monitor. Her breath held. She expected to see a weapon, a look of malice, a sign of the monster she had conjured in her mind. Instead, she saw Martha sink to her knees. On the small, low-resolution screen, Sarah watched as Martha began to sob. It wasn't the loud, dramatic weeping of a performer. It was a silent, racking grief that shook her entire frame. Martha reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, knitted bootie, the twin to the one Sarah believed Leo was wearing. Martha pressed the tiny piece of wool to her lips and curled into a ball on the floor. Why are you doing that? Sarah whispered to the monitor, her brow furrowed in confusion. Why are you pretending to be sad? A cold realization began to seep into Sarah's mind, but she pushed it back with violent force. Martha was trying to trick the cameras. She must have found them. She was acting for the jury Sarah intended to show the footage to. Yes, that was it. She was more cunning than Sarah had realized. The door handle turned slowly. Martha was trying to get in. Sarah? Please let me in. Martha's voice came through the wood, muffled and thick with tears. I've made some soup. You haven't eaten in 2 days. You're fading away, Sarah. Please, just for a moment, let's sit together. No talk of the baby. No talk of the past. Just you and me. Go away, Sarah yelled, clutching the blue blanket tighter. The wool felt strangely light, almost hollow. I know what's in the soup. I know what you're trying to do. There's nothing in the soup but salt and water, Sarah. Martha cried out, her voice breaking. There is no baby. There is no one in that room but you and your ghost. For the love of God, Sarah, look at your arms. Look at what you're holding. Sarah looked down. She saw Leo's face, his eyes closed in a peaceful slumber. She saw his tiny nose, his rosebud mouth. She saw her son. You're a liar, Sarah whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. You're a liar and a murderer. You killed him in your heart the day he was born. And now you want to kill him for real. She stood up and walked to the window. Below, the garden was a graveyard of shadows. She saw the police station down the road, its blue light a beacon of hope in the darkness. She didn't need the cameras. She would go there herself. She would tell them everything. She would tell them about the accidents, the whispers, and the woman who cried fake tears at the nursery door. But as she reached for the window latch, she felt a sudden, sharp pain in her temple. Her vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt, the walls bleeding into the floor. She saw 2 Marthas, then 3. She saw the nursery furniture dissolve into mist. In the chaos of her mind, a voice that wasn't hers, yet sounded exactly like her, whispered, "She's coming for us. We have to finish it. We have to make the evidence permanent." Sarah looked at the vase on the dresser. It was heavy lead crystal, a wedding gift from Martha. She picked it up, her fingers finding a cold, murderous strength. She wouldn't just record the monster. She would stop her. The lock on the door clicked. Martha had found the spare key. As the door swung open, Sarah stood in the center of the room, the vase raised high, her face a mask of fractured reality. Behind her, the crib sat empty, the blue blanket trailing on the floor like a discarded shroud. The trap was set, but Sarah didn't realize she was the one caught in it. The air in the nursery had thickened into something viscous, making every breath Sarah took feel like she was inhaling cold ash. She stood motionless, the heavy crystal vase clutched in her hands, its sharp edges biting into her palms. The weight of it was grounding. The only real thing in a world that had begun to flicker like a dying light bulb. Behind her, the crib remained bathed in a sickly pale glow from the moon, housing nothing but the crumpled blue blanket and the silence that had become Sarah's only constant companion. The door creaked open further. Martha stepped inside, her hands held out in front of her, palms open, a universal gesture of peace that Sarah interpreted as the predatory reach of a captor. Martha's face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, and her eyes were rimmed with a terrifying, exhaustion-induced red. She looked at Sarah, then her gaze flickered to the heavy vase, and finally, inevitably, to the empty crib. "Sarah," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "Put the vase down. You're shaking. You're going to hurt yourself." "Stay back," Sarah warned, her voice coming from deep within her throat, sounding like a stranger's. "I saw what you did on the monitor. I saw you kneeling. I saw you crying. You think you can fool me with your theatrics? You think I don't know you're trying to gaslight me into believing my son is a ghost?" Martha took a slow, agonizing step forward. "He isn't a ghost, Sarah. He's a memory. A beautiful, tragic memory. But he isn't in that crib. He hasn't been in that crib for 14 months. Please, honey. You've stopped taking the medicine the doctor gave you. You've locked yourself in this room with nothing but shadows." "The medicine made him go away," Sarah shrieked, the sound echoing off the bare walls. "Every time I took those pills, Leo would get quiet. He would fade. You wanted me drugged so you could finish what you started. You couldn't stand that he was mine. You couldn't stand that he was the only thing Mark truly loved." A flash of genuine agony crossed Martha's face. "Mark loves you, Sarah. He's heartbroken. He's working double shifts just to pay for the specialists for the care you need. He isn't away on business. He's at the hospital, trying to find a way to bring his wife back from the dark. He can't bear to see you like this, holding a blanket and talking to the air." Sarah laughed, a jagged, broken sound that lacked any trace of mirth. "The air? Is that what you call him? I can hear his breathing right now. I can feel the heat radiating from him." She glanced back at the crib, and for a split second, the veil lifted. She saw a pile of dirty wool. But then, her mind recoiled, snapping back into the safety of the lie. The wool transformed back into a sleeping infant, his chest rising and falling in perfect, rhythmic peace. "He's right there, Martha. Are you blind, or just evil?" Martha's resolve seemed to break. She sank onto the edge of the rocking chair. The one where the hidden recorder was buried inside the teddy bear. "I'm not evil, Sarah. I'm just a mother who lost her grandson, watching her daughter-in-law lose her mind. I stayed. When Mark wanted to put you in a facility, I told him no. I told him I could help you. I thought if I stayed close, if I kept the house clean, if I kept the memory of Leo alive through the things we held, you would eventually find your way back to us." "You stayed to watch us suffer," Sarah countered, her grip on the vase tightening until her knuckles turned white. "I've documented everything. The hidden cameras, they saw you. They saw you touching his things. They saw the hate in your eyes." Martha looked at the bookshelf where the USB camera was hidden. She didn't look angry. She looked defeated. If those cameras saw anything, they saw a woman who spends her nights praying for a miracle. They saw a woman who hasn't slept in a bed for months because she's afraid you'll hurt yourself in the middle of the night. If you have footage, Sarah, please, watch it. Really watch it. Not the version your head is making up. "I've seen enough," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "The police will be here soon. I sent the signal." In reality, Sarah had done no such thing. She had typed a frantic, nonsensical email to a defunct address, believing she was contacting the authorities. But in her mind, the sirens were already wailing in the distance. A chorus of justice coming to rescue her from the witch in the hallway. Martha stood up again, her movements stiff. "No one is coming, Sarah. Only Mark, and he won't be home until dawn. It's just us. It's always been just us. Please give me the vase. Let's go downstairs. I'll make you tea, and we can look at the old albums. The real ones. The ones from before the accident. The accident, Sarah repeated, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. You keep calling it that. It wasn't an accident. It was you. You cursed us. You told me he didn't have your eyes, and then you made sure he would never open them again. As Sarah spoke, the second Sarah, the personality born from the trauma of the hospital room where she was told her baby was stillborn, began to take full control. This version of Sarah didn't see a grieving mother-in-law. She saw a demon. Martha's face began to distort in Sarah's vision, her skin graying, her eyes becoming black pits of malice. The scent of lavender became the stench of rot. You're not going to take him, Sarah whispered, moving toward Martha. Martha backed away, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. Sarah, stop. Look at me. I'm Marta. I'm the woman who held you while you screamed in the delivery room. I'm the one who buried that sweet boy while you were too catatonic to speak. Liar. Sarah swung the vase. It was a clumsy, desperate arc, but the weight of the crystal made it lethal. Martha ducked, the vase whistling past her ear and shattering against the doorframe. Shards of glass exploded like diamonds, slicing through the air. One piece caught Martha across the cheek, drawing a thin line of bright, red blood. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her face. She looked at the blood on her fingers, then at Sarah, her eyes wide with a new, paralyzing fear. Not fear for herself, but the realization that the woman in front of her was truly, utterly gone. Oh, Sarah, Martha sobbed, the blood leaking through her fingers. My poor sweet girl. The sight of the blood triggered something in Sarah. Not remorse, but a confirmation of her delusions. To her, the red liquid wasn't human blood. It was the stolen life Martha had taken from Leo. See? Sarah pointed at the wound, her face contorted in a horrific grin. You're bleeding his life. You've had it all along. She lunged again, her hands reaching for Martha's throat. The two women crashed into the rocking chair, sending the teddy bear, and the recorder hidden within, tumbling to the floor. As they struggled, the recorder was jostled, and a voice began to play back from the tiny speaker. It was Sarah's voice recorded hours earlier, but it sounded distorted, demonic, repeating a single phrase over and over. He's not dead. He's not dead. He's not dead. The sound of her own voice, echoing in the dark room, sent Sarah into a final, violent frenzy. She didn't see a mother-in-law anymore. She saw the end of her world, and she was determined to burn it all down before the truth could catch her. The struggle on the nursery floor was a chaotic symphony of heavy breathing, the rustle of dry wool, and the glitching playback of Sarah's own recorded voice. To Sarah, the woman beneath her was no longer Martha. The shadows of the room had warped Martha's features into something jagged and reptilian. Every time Martha's hands reached up to catch Sarah's wrists, Sarah saw skeletal claws attempting to drag her away from her child. Get away from him! Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. She lunged for the fallen teddy bear, the one housing the recorder, and swung it like a flail. Martha scrambled backward, her back hitting the legs of the crib. The impact caused the wooden structure to rattle, a hollow, lifeless sound that echoed through the room. Sarah, look at the crib. Martha cried out, her voice desperate and raw. It's empty. There is no one there to save. You're fighting a war for a ghost. But Sarah's mind wouldn't let the truth in. The second Sarah, the protector born from the ashes of her grief, was firmly at the helm. She didn't see an empty crib. She saw Leo huddled in the corner of the mattress, his face pale with terror, his tiny hands reaching out for her. The sight of her child, in distress, sent a new wave of adrenaline through her veins. I'm coming, Leo, she whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused. She turned back to Martha, who was now standing, leaning heavily against the wall for support. The cut on Martha's cheek had stopped bleeding, leaving a dark, jagged smear across her pale skin. In the moonlight, the older woman looked fragile, broken by the weight of a tragedy she hadn't caused but was forced to inhabit. You think you're so smart, Sarah hissed, moving in a slow, predatory circle. You think because Mark isn't here, you can finally finish it. You've been poisoning the air in this house. You've been whispering to him when I'm not in the room, telling him he's not wanted. I've heard you through the walls, Martha. I've heard you telling him to just stop. Martha shook her head, tears spilling over. I was talking to you, Sarah. I was sitting in the hallway outside your locked door, begging you to eat. I was telling you that we could get through this if you just let me in. I was talking to my son on the phone, crying because I didn't know how to save the woman he loves. Lies. Sarah lunged again. This time, Martha was ready. She didn't retreat. She stepped into the collision, wrapping her arms around Sarah in a fierce, suffocating embrace. It wasn't an attack. It was a restraint. She used her weight to pin Sarah's arms to her sides, dragging them both toward the floor. Listen to me. Martha shouted over Sarah's incoherent rages. Think back to the hospital, Sarah. Think of the silence. Do you remember the silence? There was no cry. There was no breath. The doctor put his hand on your shoulder. Mark cried so hard he couldn't stand up. Do you remember? For a heartbeat, the world stopped spinning. A memory, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through Sarah's delusions. She saw a sterile white room. She saw a flat line on a monitor. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of a grief so profound it felt like dying. But then, the protector intervened. The second Sarah shoved the memory back into the dark. She's trying to kill him with words, the voice whispered. Asterisk, if you believe her, he dies. If you listen, he vanishes. Asterisk. Sarah let out a guttural howl, and bit down hard on Martha's shoulder. Martha shrieked and let go, falling back against the bookshelf. The impact knocked several heavy volumes to the floor, along with the hidden USB camera Sarah had planted. Sarah grabbed the camera, staring at the tiny lens. I have it now, she laughed, a high-pitched manic sound. I have the proof. I'll show the world what you did. I'll show them how you tried to convince a mother her son was dead. She scrambled toward the door, her movements frantic. She needed to get to her laptop. She needed to upload the footage. In her mind, the footage would show Martha sneaking into the room with a pillow, Martha whispering threats, Martha being the monster Sarah needed her to be. Martha stayed on the floor, gasping for air, watching as Sarah bolted into the hallway. Sarah, wait. Don't look at it. Please don't look at the footage. Sarah didn't listen. She slammed her bedroom door and pushed the heavy dresser in front of it. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely plug the USB device into her laptop. The screen flickered to life, the blue light casting a ghostly glow over her sweat-streaked face. The file explorer opened. There was only one long video file. Now, Sarah whispered, her thumb hovering over the touchpad. Now everyone will see. She clicked play. The video was grainy, a fixed wide-angle shot of the nursery from the perspective of the bookshelf. It was time-stamped from 3 hours ago. Sarah watched the screen with bated breath. On the video, the nursery was silent. The crib was clearly visible. It was empty. The mattress was bare except for a flat, blue wool blanket. Then a figure entered the frame. It was Sarah. On the screen, Sarah walked over to the empty crib. She reached down and began to stroke the air above the blanket. Her lips were moving, but there was no sound. She looked down with a gaze of pure, radiant love at absolutely nothing. She picked up the blue blanket, cradling it against her shoulder, rocking back and forth. No, Sarah whispered at the laptop screen. The camera is broken. It's a trick. She rigged the camera. She fast-forwarded. The sun set on the video, and the room grew dark. Then Martha entered the frame. In the video, Martha didn't look like a monster. She looked like a ghost. She stood by the door, her head bowed. She walked over to the rocking chair and picked up a small, silver rattle that Sarah had left on the floor. Martha held it to her chest and began to sob, her shoulders shaking with a grief that felt so real it seemed to bleed through the screen. Then the video showed the confrontation Sarah had just lived through. Sarah watched herself, the woman on the screen, screaming at nothing, lunging at Martha with a crystal vase. She saw herself pointing at the empty crib, her face contorted in a terrifying mask of madness. She saw Martha ducking, bleeding, and finally trying to hold her, not out of hate, but out of a desperate, dying hope. The most horrifying part wasn't Martha. It was the baby. Every time the camera caught the blue blanket in Sarah's arms, it was just that, a blanket. There was no face. There were no eyes. There was no Leo. Sarah stared at the screen, her breath hitching in her throat. The fortress she had built in her mind began to crumble. The walls of her reality didn't just crack, they disintegrated. A soft knock came from the bedroom door. Sarah. Martha's voice was calm now, resigned. I've called the ambulance. Not for the police. For a doctor. They're coming to help you, honey. Please come out. Don't be alone with that screen. Sarah looked from the laptop to the shadows in the corner of her room. She saw the blue blanket lying on the floor where she had dropped it. For the first time in over a year, she didn't see a boy. She saw a piece of fabric. The silence of the house finally settled into her bones. It wasn't the silence of a sleeping child. It was the silence of a grave. Leo, she whispered, her voice small and childlike. There was no answer. There never had been. The weight of the truth hit her with the force of a tidal wave. The second Sarah, the protector, didn't fight back this time. It simply vanished, leaving the real Sarah alone in the ruins of her life, holding a handful of shadows and a heart that had finally, mercifully, broken. The screen of the laptop continued to glow, a cold, clinical blue that illuminated the wreckage of Sarah's bedroom. On the video, the woman who looked like Sarah, but felt like a stranger, was still rocking that empty blue blanket. The silence in the room was no longer the peaceful quiet of a sleeping child. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a morgue. Every blink of Sarah's eyes felt like a shutter clicking on a new, horrifying reality. She stared at her hands. They were stained with the dust of the nursery and the faint, copper smear of Martha's blood. For months, she had believed these hands were protecting a miracle. Now, she saw them for what they were. Instruments of a delusion, clutching at shadows while the woman who had actually tried to save her bled in the hallway. Sarah. Martha's voice came again, softer this time, pressing against the heavy oak of the bedroom door. The ambulance is turning onto the street. I can see the lights. Please, honey, move the dresser. Just let me sit with you until they get here. Sarah didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs felt like they had been hollowed out, replaced with lead. Her gaze drifted from the laptop to the corner of the room where the protector usually stood, that second version of herself, the one with the sharpened teeth and the iron will. But the corner was empty. The second Sarah had done her job. She had kept the grief at bay until it was too late to survive it. Now she had vanished, leaving the original Sarah to drown in the wake. A memory surfaced, unbidden and violent. It wasn't the sterile hospital room this time. It was the ride home. Mark had been driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his face a mask of shattered glass. Sarah had been in the back seat, her arms wrapped around a bundle of clothes she had refused to leave behind. She remembered the way the wind had hissed through the cracked window, sounding like a name. Leo. Asterisk, she had started talking to the bundle then. She remembered the look on Mark's face in the rearview mirror. A look of such profound horror that she had immediately looked away. To protect herself from that look, she had built the first brick of the wall. She had decided, right there on the highway, that Mark was wrong, that the doctors were wrong, that the world was a liar, and only she knew the truth. And Martha. Poor enduring Martha. Sarah looked back at the video. She saw the moment Martha had entered the nursery 3 nights ago. In Sarah's memory, Martha had been carrying a needle, a sedative to put the baby to sleep forever. But on the screen, Martha was carrying a small bowl of warm water and a soft cloth. She had waited until Sarah fell asleep in the rocking chair, and then she had gently wiped the dust off the nursery shelves. She had picked up the blue blanket from the floor, kissed it, and folded it neatly at the foot of the crib. She wasn't an assassin. She was a maid in the temple of Sarah's madness. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered, but the words died in the dry cavern of her throat. The sound of sirens began to swell, a rhythmic, haunting wail that sliced through the night. The red and blue lights began to dance against the wallpaper, turning the floral patterns into pulsing, bloody veins. The proof Sarah had sought to get rid of. Martha was now the evidence of her own undoing. With a strength born of pure, agonizing shame, Sarah stood up. She lurched toward the dresser, her muscles screaming. She pushed. The heavy wood groaned against the floorboards, a sound of protest that seemed to echo the last 14 months of her life. Inch by inch, the barrier gave way. When the door finally swung open, Martha was there. She was slumped against the opposite wall. A makeshift bandage made of a kitchen towel pressed to her cheek. She looked up, and for the first time, Sarah didn't see a demon. She saw a mother who had lost everything twice over. First her grandson, and then the daughter-in-law she had tried to replace him with. "I saw it," Sarah said, her voice a ghostly reed. "The camera. I saw. There's no one there, Martha." Martha closed her eyes, a sob escaping her lips that sounded like a long-held breath finally being released. She reached out her hand, trembling, unsure if the woman standing before her was Sarah, or the monster that had lived in her skin. "I know, honey," Martha choked out. "I know." Sarah collapsed at Martha's feet, her forehead resting on the older woman's knees. She wept then, not the manic, angry tears of the past few weeks, but a deep, primal mourning. She wept for the son who never took a breath. She wept for Mark, who was probably sitting in a hospital waiting room somewhere, waiting for a phone call that would tell him his wife had finally broken for good. And she wept for Martha, whom she had turned into a villain because the truth was too heavy to carry alone. "Why didn't you leave?" Sarah sobbed into Martha's apron. "I hit you. I screamed at you. Why didn't you just let the police take me a long time ago?" Martha's hand settled on Sarah's head, her fingers stroking her hair with a tenderness that felt like a benediction. "Because I remembered who you were before the dark took you," Martha whispered. "And because, when my son lost his boy, I couldn't let him lose his wife too. You're all we have left, Sarah. Even the broken version of you was worth more than the silence." Downstairs, the front door was kicked open. Heavy boots thudded on the stairs. Shouts of police and paramedics filled the air. Flashlights cut through the hallway, their beams erratic and blinding. Sarah looked up at the nursery door one last time. In the strobe-like flicker of the emergency lights, she saw the crib. For a fleeting, cruel second, her mind tried to conjure Leo one last time. She saw a shadow move. She heard a phantom cry. But then, the light stayed steady. The crib was empty. The room was just a room. The tragedy was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a reality to be lived. As the paramedics reached the top of the stairs, Martha gripped Sarah's hand tightly. "Don't fight them," Martha whispered. "It's time to go, Sarah. It's time to come back to us." Sarah nodded, letting the heavy weight of the world finally settle onto her shoulders. The door to the nursery stayed open as they led her away. The blue blanket lying forgotten on the floor. A small, square island of wool in a sea of cold, hard wood. The haunting was over, but the healing, long, agonizing, and quiet, was only just beginning. The sterile white walls of the psychiatric ward were a stark contrast to the heavy, shadow-drenched Victorian house Sarah had left behind. Here, there were no narrow corridors or groaning floorboards to feed her paranoia. There was only the hum of the air conditioner and the soft, squeaky footfalls of nurses in the hallway. For the first few weeks, Sarah lived in a state of catatonic grace. The second Sarah, the fierce protector who had swung crystal vases and screamed of conspiracies, had retreated into the deepest recesses of her psyche, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell that barely knew its own name. She sat by the reinforced glass window of the communal lounge, her gaze fixed on a distant oak tree. Her hands, once perpetually clenched around a blue wool blanket, now lay limp in her lap. The doctors called it the crash. It was the moment the brain, exhausted by the sheer labor of maintaining a year-long hallucination, finally surrendered to the weight of reality. "You have a visitor, Sarah," a nurse said softly, touching her shoulder. Sarah didn't turn. She knew it wouldn't be Mark. Mark had come twice in the first week, but the sight of her, the way she looked through him as if he were a ghost, had broken him in a way the initial tragedy hadn't. He was currently in a residential treatment center of his own, halfway across the country, trying to find the pieces of the man he used to be before his wife became a stranger. It was Martha. It was always Martha. The older woman sat down in the plastic chair opposite Sarah. She didn't try to hold Sarah's hand this time. She knew the boundaries of the fracture. Martha looked different now. The sharp, flinty edge she had cultivated as a defense mechanism had softened into something weary and fragile. The bandage was gone from her cheek, replaced by a thin silvery scar, a permanent map of the night the illusion shattered. "I brought you some books," Martha said, her voice steady but thin. And some yarn. The doctor said working with your hands might help. Sarah finally shifted her gaze. She looked at Martha's hands. The hands she had once believed were clawed and predatory. They were shaking. Why do you come here? Sarah's voice was a dry rasp, and used for days. I tried to put you in prison. I tried to. I almost killed you. Martha managed a small, bittersweet smile. I've lived 60 years, Sarah. I've learned that people are rarely their worst moments. That night in the nursery, that wasn't you. That was the grief. Grief is a thief, honey. It steals your eyes and gives you a nightmare to look through. Sarah looked down at the floor. I can still hear him sometimes. In the middle of the night, when the ward is quiet, I hear a cry. I reach out for the blanket, and when I realize it's not there, I feel like I'm losing him all over again. Every single night he dies again. I know, Martha whispered. I hear it too. Not in the hallway, but in the silence of that big, empty house. Every time I pass that door, I expect to hear him. We're both haunted, Sarah. The only difference is that you tried to build a world where the haunting was real, so you wouldn't have to say goodbye. They sat in silence for a long time. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a shared burden. Sarah realized that Martha wasn't just there to support her. Martha was there because they were the only two people in the world who truly understood the shape of the hole Leo had left behind. Mark had fled from the pain, but Martha had stood right in the center of the storm and let it batter her. The police dropped the charges, Martha said suddenly. I told them it was an accident. A mental health crisis. They won't be coming for you, Sarah. You don't have to be afraid of the law anymore. Sarah felt a strange pang of guilt. But I should be punished. I made you a monster in my head. I told everyone you were abusing him. I wanted the world to hate you so I could feel like a hero. You were a hero, Martha countered, her voice growing firm. In your mind, you were a mother fighting a demon to save her child. That's a noble thing. Even if the demon was a grandmother and the child was a memory, you fought for him with everything you had. Now, you have to find that same strength to fight for yourself. As the weeks turned into months, the second Sarah attempted to return. There were days when Sarah would wake up and feel the old paranoia itching at the back of her skull. She would see a nurse holding a tray and think poison. She would see a locked door and think prison. But now she had a weapon she didn't have before, Martha's scar. Whenever the darkness started to warp her vision, she would look at Martha during their visits. She would look at that thin, silver line on Martha's cheek and remind herself of what was real. The scar was the truth. The blood had been real. The love that kept Martha coming back was real. One afternoon, during a therapy session, Sarah was asked to draw her family. She picked up a charcoal pencil and hesitated. For a long time, she had only drawn two people. Herself and a small, faceless boy in a blue blanket. Mark and Martha had always been shadows in the background, if they appeared at all. Slowly, she began to draw a house. It wasn't the Victorian mansion of her nightmares, but a simple, sturdy structure. In the window, she drew a woman with a scar on her cheek. And next to her, she drew herself. Where is the baby? The therapist asked gently. Sarah looked at the paper. Her heart twisted, a sharp, physical ache that made her breath hitch. She picked up the eraser and rubbed out the space where the nursery would be. He's not in the house anymore, Sarah said, her voice trembling but clear. He's in the garden. He's in the trees. He's somewhere where it doesn't hurt to breathe. When Martha arrived for her visit that day, Sarah showed her the drawing. Martha took the paper, her fingers trembling as she traced the outline of the woman in the window. A single tear fell onto the page, smudging the charcoal. We're going to sell the house, Sarah, Martha said quietly. Mark and I talked. It's too much for any of us. We found a small place by the coast. Somewhere with a lot of light. Somewhere where the wind sounds like the sea. And nothing else. Sarah nodded. The thought of leaving the nursery, the place where she had kept Leo alive for so long, was terrifying. But as she looked at Martha, she realized that she didn't need the room to remember him. She had the scar. She had the grief. And for the first time, she had a mother who had earned that title through fire and blood. Can I come with you? Sarah asked. Martha reached across the table and finally took Sarah's hand. Her grip was strong, warm, and undeniably real. I wouldn't have it any other way, Sarah. We're going home. Both of us. As they sat together in the fading light of the ward, the second Sarah finally went silent. The war was over. The nursery was empty. But in the quiet, a new kind of life was beginning to take root. One built not on the desperate lies of a broken mind, but on the scarred, resilient truth of two women who had refused to let go of each other. The coastal cottage was small, weathered by salt and time, but it possessed something the Victorian mansion never did: light. Large windows faced the Atlantic, allowing the morning sun to wash over the whitewashed walls and the simple wooden furniture. There were no dark corners here, no heavy velvet curtains to hide behind. The air didn't smell of stale lavender or dust. It smelled of brine, damp sand, and the wild, untamed promise of the sea. Sarah stood on the small wooden deck, her hair, now shorter and streaked with premature gray, whipping around her face in the breeze. It had been 6 months since she left the psychiatric ward, and 3 months since they had moved to this edge of the world. She still took her medication every morning, a ritual of survival that she no longer resented. The pills didn't make Leo disappear. They simply took away the jagged edges of the world, allowing her to see things as they truly were. Behind her, the sliding glass door creaked open. Martha stepped out, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The scar on her cheek had faded to a thin, barely visible line, but it remained the most important feature of her face to Sarah. It was a badge of reality, a reminder that they had both survived the unthinkable. "The tide is coming in," Martha said, handing a mug to Sarah. Her voice was no longer the sharp, defensive rasp Sarah remembered from the House of Shadows. It was soft, grounded, like the sound of the waves hitting the shore. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, taking a sip. The warmth of the ceramic against her palms was a grounding sensation she practiced daily. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to look at the horizon without looking for a reason to run." Martha leaned against the railing, staring out at the gray-blue expanse. "Nature has a way of reminding us that things move on, whether we're ready or not. The waves don't care about our ghosts, Sarah. They just keep coming." They had spent the last 90 days learning how to be a family without the glue of a child to hold them together. It was a quiet, deliberate process. They talked about the mundane: what to have for dinner, the leak in the kitchen sink, the garden they were trying to start in the sandy soil. But they also talked about the gaps. The gaps were the moments when the silence became too heavy, when Sarah would see a blue blanket in a shop window and have to lean against a wall to catch her breath. Or when Martha would find one of Mark's old baby toys in a moving box and retreat to her room for hours. Mark visited them once a month. He was living in the city now, working a steady job and attending his own therapy sessions. The 3 of them were like survivors of a shipwreck who had washed up on different islands, but kept a bonfire burning for one another. There was no talk of reconciliation between Mark and Sarah yet. The trauma was too deep, the memories too stained by the second Sarah. But there was peace. A fragile, hard-won peace. "I had the dream again last night," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes still on the water. Martha didn't flinch. "The nursery?" "No, Sarah replied. "We were here. You, me, and Mark. We were sitting on the beach, and there was a boy. He wasn't a baby anymore. He was maybe 5 or 6, running toward the waves. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was laughing." She paused, her throat tightening. "But for the first time, when I woke up, I wasn't angry that he was gone. I felt grateful that I got to see him grow up, even if it was just for a few seconds in my head." Martha reached out and covered Sarah's hand with her own. "That's the healing, honey. That's you taking the memory back from the madness." Sarah turned to look at her mother-in-law. "I used to think you were the one keeping me in prison, Martha. I spent so much time trying to find a way to lock you away. I was so convinced that if I could just get rid of you, Leo would be safe." "I know," Martha said quietly. "And I spent a lot of time being angry at you for it. I thought you were selfish, that you were indulging in your pain while I had to carry the weight of the whole world. But I realized that night in the nursery that you weren't indulging. You were drowning. And you don't blame a drowning person for splashing the one trying to pull them out." The sun climbed higher, turning the foam of the waves into sparkling diamonds. Sarah felt a strange, light sensation in her chest, Not the manic high of her delusions, but a quiet, steady sense of presence. She wasn't the woman she was before the pregnancy, and she wasn't the monster she became after the loss. She was someone new, forged in the fire of a tragedy that had nearly consumed her. "I brought something out," Martha said, reaching into the pocket of her cardigan. She pulled out a small, silver rattle, the heirloom Sarah had once used as a weapon of accusation. Sarah's breath hitched. "You kept it." "I kept it," Martha nodded. "But I think it's time. We've been carrying it for too long, Sarah. It's too heavy for a house this small." They walked down the wooden stairs of the deck and onto the beach. The sand was cool and damp under their feet. They walked until the water swirled around their ankles, the cold salt air stinging their lungs. Sarah took the rattle from Martha's hand. It felt light, singularly, remarkably light. She looked at the silver engravings, reflecting the bright morning sun. She thought of the hospital room. She thought of the blue blanket. She thought of the woman who had screamed in the dark. And then, she thought of the silence that followed. "Goodbye, Leo," she whispered. With a smooth, practiced motion, Sarah threw the rattle as far as she could. It caught the light one last time, a silver spark against the blue sky, before disappearing into the white foam of a breaking wave. The sea swallowed it instantly, dragging it down into the depths where secrets and sorrows are kept. Sarah stood there for a long time, watching the spot where it had vanished. She expected to feel a void, a sudden return of the second Sarah, screaming at the loss. But there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the steady heartbeat of the ocean. Martha put an arm around Sarah's shoulders, pulling her close. They stood together, two women bound by a ghost and saved by the truth. "Let's go back inside," Martha said. "I think the garden needs watering." Sarah nodded, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. She didn't look back at the water. As they walked toward the cottage, the light reflecting off the windows felt like a welcome home. The nursery was gone. The cameras were gone. The madness was a closed book. For the first time in a year, Sarah wasn't a protector, a victim, or a prisoner. She was simply a woman walking toward the sun, finally ready to live in a world that was quiet, empty, and entirely real.